Hello there, and welcome to another live stream from Explain Apologetics. We are glad to have you guys join us. Today, I'll be taking over Sam's job. I've taken over his position, stolen his job. No, just kidding. But I'll be your host today. My name is Marcus, and joining me today on the panel is no other than our founder, Pastor Samuel Nason, who's currently in the US studying in Southwestern Theological Seminary. And
We're hearing something.
taken over his position, stolen his job.
We're hearing some feedback.
But I'll be your host today. My name is Marcus, and
Stephen, are you watching that live?
today on the panel is
You need to mute that. Someone needs to mute it.
yeah, it's definitely not
Mm-hmm.
me. In the US, studying in Southwestern Theological Seminary.
It's not
Still
me.
hearing some feedback.
That's not mine.
Is it good? It's not me. Is it good?
It's someone is putting their YouTube on with their YouTube on. Who has their YouTube on?
Not me. Mine is muted.
No, mine's good. I'm good.
Okay, I think you're not hearing anything now, but yeah, sorry about that. So anyway, joining us today is, like I mentioned, our founder, Pastor Samuel Nason, who is currently in the US as well,
Right.
studying in
Right,
Southwestern Theological Seminary. And, yep, sorry?
Nope, that's right. I was just going to say,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and also our very special guest also is someone who is not unfamiliar to you guys, is no stranger. He's been on our channel a few times, and we're glad to have him back again, Dr. Stephen Boyce. Welcome back, Dr. Stephen.
Good to be back. Good to be back.
Yeah.
It's always fun.
Yeah, good to have the both of you join us this time. And of course, I'm a bit nervous hosting you guys, two big giants that I sort of looked up to as I learned more about apologetics and being in Christian ministry. So today we're going to talk about the debate that happened between Dr. Bart Ehrman and Jonathan Sheffield. It was a really exciting one. Of course, Dr. Ehrman is a big name in the field of textual criticism. I think anyone who intends to study or question the reliability of the Bible would definitely have heard of him. He is also someone who most critics of the Bible quote very often. And so it was a great honor for us at Explain to have him join us. And of course, Jonathan, being a great friend of ours, also it was a pleasure to hear him speak and to debate Dr. Ehrman as well. So getting into the debate, to reviewing the debate itself, gentlemen, why don't you just quickly share with us your general thoughts on how the entire debate went? Maybe you start off with Dr. Stephen.
No, I thought it was very well done. I wasn't sure what to expect when it started. Dr. Ehrman, I've had tremendous respect for him. I know that a lot of Christians don't, but I actually think he's one of the top scholars in this field. So for Jonathan to take on a task to discuss these issues with him was not a small thing. And I think Jonathan probably did one of his best debates. I've gotten to know Jonathan for a little while now. I watched his debate with Carrier, Dillahunty, and discussions that he's had. I've done reviews with him. I certainly think it was one of his best debates. I think that was a field he was comfortable in. He and I differ on text position, but he did bring the best arguments his text position could bring to a discussion with Dr. Ehrman. I don't feel like Dr. Ehrman talked over him. I don't think Jonathan talked over Dr. Ehrman. I think it was cordial. I was friendly, full of data that, quite frankly, if you're not well-versed in some of the terminology, they were talking to each other in such a way that they were almost speaking their own language at times that, people viewing it from home were probably scratching their head on terms. And I feel like Dr. Ehrman tried to define terms really well, actually. In his presentation, he treated it like he would in a classroom or something, because I think he recognized that a lot of people watching the debate would not understand all of the arguments. But overall, the temperature was good. The friendliness was good. The data was excellent on both sides. I think Dr. Ehrman challenged the core of an ecclesiastical position, which I'm sure we'll get into more. And I think that Jonathan challenged the core argument from Dr. Ehrman's standpoint, especially being on the skeptical side of things, bringing out the fact that the churches did not have skepticism, and that the ecclesiastical church as a whole saw that they were protecting and defending the word of God against a lot of the transmissional errors that happened, and even brought up Marcion. So I think Jonathan did a good job. I personally, and I told him I would be critical of this, I don't believe the ecclesiastical text position has a chance against Dr. Ehrman's position, because I don't think it's the best argument. I think it's a good one. I don't think it's the best one. And with that being said, he made it sound better than it really is. So I believe Jonathan did a good job. I think he is his best debate, no doubt.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Boyce. Yeah, I do agree that Dr. Ehrman's position was a bit easier to understand. He does speak in very simple terms. Honestly speaking, I, as someone who's not familiar with the field of textual criticism, I did find Jonathan's arguments to be difficult to grasp. But he does. I realize he does quote a lot of people like the early church fathers, and he brings in a lot of outside sources, Homeric texts, and various other sources. And I think that he did have the knowledge with him to sustain his arguments. How about you, Sam? And you, as the moderator, how did you feel the debate went?
Well, first up, I have to say that I had the advantage of getting to know both of them really well before the debate even started. I mean, I was the one communicating with Dr. Ehrman before, who insists, as I said in the debate, that I call him Bart. That just kind of tells you that, I mean, how friendly he was, and that really helped. Because those of you may not know this, and if you've not watched some of the previous debates we had, particularly the one between Dr. James White and Dr. Jeff Riddle, it was intense, right? The atmosphere was really, really stressful. And again, that's simply nothing. I mean, not saying nothing bad about those two gentlemen, but they take their work really, really seriously. And when I was, hosting them even prior to going live, both of them were not talking to each other. It was just me talking to the both of them. It was only after the second debate, at the end of that we actually had Dr. White actually communicating with Dr. Riddle, and vice versa. But this was completely different in terms of the atmosphere prior to the debate. Both Jonathan Sheffield and Dr. Ehrman got along really, really well. And they were chatting about other things, and that kind of carried on forward to the debate itself. They were talking about baseball, or was it football at one time? So in the second cross-examination, Dr. Ehrman basically asked Jonathan, "I've run out of questions. Which team do you support?" or something to that effect. But it was really cordial. Some of the feedback I was getting was perhaps too cordial. We want to see a little bit more fight going on here. These two guys really, really respect each other. And that was wonderful to see. In fact, I got an email from Dr. Ehrman early this morning that I've yet to reply to. But Dr. Ehrman had so much fun. He said he would love to be back again on Explain Apologetics. And I know that Jonathan, of course, definitely will be. He's a close friend. So I can tell you that both of them had fun before, during, and after the debate. But as far as the debate goes, I think everything that Stephen said was absolutely spot on. I think that you have a kind of a solid position, a solid argument rather, that was put forward by Jonathan. Jonathan, fully agree. He and I spoke this morning. I'm supposed to talk to him after this live stream. Jonathan did one of the most amazing performances in a debate that I've seen him do. I've never seen him do a debate better than the one he's done. We were speaking a lot leading up to this debate as well, and he was telling me, I'm doing a lot of work. He lost a lot of sleep. He prepared really, really hard. I know how seriously Jonathan took this. If anything, he was scripted throughout that entire debate. That was how well he planned for this. I mean, he really planned hard. He studied the scholars that Dr. Ehrman would be referencing. He tried his best to anticipate where Dr. Ehrman would come from. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But in short, Jonathan's performance in the debate I thought was spectacular. And as a moderator, I never had to intervene between the both of them, because there was only one point in the cross-examination that I actually had to maybe tell Dr. Ehrman to not interrupt Jonathan when he had the floor, when he was questioning, to let him finish the question rather. But I mean, Dr. Ehrman was very quick to apologize. It was very cordial all around. But I felt in terms of who won the debate, it was very clear that Dr. Ehrman won that debate, hands down, no dispute. But it was a fantastic performance by Jonathan. No one can deny that. But if anything, I feel that we kind of saw the best of both positions put out yesterday. That's basically a general overview of how I think that debate went. And yeah, I mean, I think that everything that Stephen said, I second that.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Sam. And yes, certainly that was a very fun debate. So let's get into the smaller details. What do you guys think of Dr. Ehrman's opening statement? To me, it was very clear. It was an argument that has always been made about the transmission of the text of scripture. So what do you guys think about that? Maybe we'll start with you, Sam, this time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I think that you used the word clear, and I think that was the advantage that Bart had over Jonathan yesterday. And part of the reason is because Jonathan was so much, he was really focused a lot on the facts, and the substance was there, so that you actually had to know a lot before you can actually understand what Jonathan was actually saying. So I kept emphasizing this even as a moderator. There was a lot of substance both sides yesterday, no doubts about that. But it seemed that Bart had the advantage both in as far as the rhetoric was concerned. Bart was actually able to appeal to people who knew very little about the subject. You would see him using illustrations over and over again, practical illustrations that people who had never even heard of textual criticism would be able to relate with and kind of understand that. And I felt that was Bart's advantage in that sense, that he's just a fantastic communicator, and he was able to appeal to those people. But I mean, as far as substance goes, both of them had substance yesterday, no dispute on that. But Bart was able to communicate with clarity. And I think in terms of, as far as people, I mean, again, Stephen is an expert on this area. I know we had a lot of people who were, I mean, James Knapp was watching this yesterday. I know we had a lot of people that were watching that knew their stuff. They would be able to analyze it on a completely different level than someone, a lay person, would. But I think that Dr. Ehrman's position was appealing a lot to the lay people. And I think in terms of clarity, that stood out.
Right. How about you, Dr. Boyce?
Well, I think that's always been Dr. Ehrman's advantage, is when he wrote Misquoting Jesus, he didn't do it because he reached the academic world. He did not sell a New York Times #1 bestseller and set records on Amazon for purchases and sales on an academic level. What he did is what Christianity is bad at doing. That is taking an academic concept and bringing it down to the everyday person. And to me, and you can ask Jonathan, in the middle of the debate, right when the presentation happened, I actually sent a message to Jonathan. I was like, man, I've heard this 1,000 times, because if you watch Dr. Ehrman frequently, or you listen to his lectures, I mean, even for some of my courses in my PhD work, I had to listen to 20 of his lectures on the 2nd and 3rd century fathers. And he's excellent. He's a tremendous teacher. When you talk about a guy you want for a professor, that's who you want. He's down to earth. He's funny, informative, but he brings a complex argument and makes it simple. And so he demonstrated that. One, he screen shared his view and did a slideshow so people can follow your arguments there. Point 1, point 2, point 3. And we're actually going to show shortly a clip of that. And so it's easier to follow that way. So he had the advantage to Jonathan on that. Availability of material he was arguing for because he put it on the screen. And he's just really good at bringing things down to earth. Now, when it comes to initial debate material, Jonathan brought better debate material in his introduction. In fact, Jonathan's opening was excellent. If you're an academic person And again, when you're doing debates, you think about the crowd, but you don't think about the crowd. Like you want to think about them and make sure they're with you. But at the end of the day, you're engaging your opponent first, and the overflow of that goes to the crowd. So Jonathan, from an academic standpoint of an introduction and as far as textbook debate, he did an excellent job. He outdid Ehrman on substance of attacking issues, whereas Bart Ehrman's was more informative. And anybody watching it, which Dr. Ehrman wins the crowds, he won the crowd when it comes to popularity, clarity, as Samuel said. You even said it yourself, Marcus. You were able to follow that and understand it more. So he won on presentation and all that. When it comes to debatable issues and textual data and attack mode, Jonathan actually won that. So I'll call it a duel. One won the pretty points, one won the data points.
All right. Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Boyce. Now, before we get to both of your thoughts on Jonathan's opening statement, why not because since we talk a lot about how his arguments were very deep, and he actually quotes from so many different people, different sources, and there are a lot of Christian academic jargons that I'm sure that many who are lay people would not be able to understand. So maybe let's just talk about defining some of the terms. A lot of the terms that came up were such as the Byzantine text, the ecclesiastical text, the Peshitta, the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, and there were a lot more. But maybe on just these five, can you give a brief introduction to what these things are, Dr. Boyce?
Yeah, sure. So the Byzantine text is obviously mostly from a region of Byzantium or Constantinople. It's been called Istanbul. It's been changed quite a bit. But most of those manuscripts are later. Now, the reason can be a couple of reasons, which was most of the debate, is those types of readings just did not exist before. Some did, some did not. Whereas down in Egypt, you have the wonderful sands and dry climate that preserved these papyri, which was leaves. I mean, that's just compacted leaves is really what it was. And papyri lasted, 100 to 120 years, somewhere in that range, typically. But if you're up in the regions of the West, or if you're up over where Byzantium is due to weather, those kind of manuscripts just would not survive. The sands of Egypt preserved a lot of the manuscripts. So those are going to be the older ones. So the question that has to be asked is, since those regions didn't have the opportunity to survive documents like the dry climate in Egypt, what was the church using out there? Now, Dr. Ehrman would reference the fact that the church fathers, many of their quotes, in fact, it sounded to me like he said all of their quotes, were more of that early text form. Now, the terms have changed in the academic world, so let me not confuse you. There used to be considered text types. Now, the Byzantine is pretty much the only one that still has a text type. They used to say there's an Alexandrian text type, which is more the earlier ones in the papyri, or you heard two major manuscripts mentioned a few times, Aleph and B, or Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which would be considered Alexandrian text types. The Western text types was another term. And again, these terms are not used, they're not referred to as text types anymore. But they were once seen that way because of the differences. There's like this unique habit of transmission. And then you had the Western, which seemed to be fitted more towards what would be considered Latin traditions that came in. And then there's another one that's still debated in scholarship, whether there was a Caesarean reading or Caesarean text type. And that's really due to a man they brought up that we'll talk about in a little bit, Origen. And once Origen made a change of life and he moved, his quotations started changing slightly to a slightly different reading, which would be considered more in that region of Caesarea. And so there's really four major readings, and they're no longer considered text types in the academic world, maybe the Byzantine, but the Byzantine is later. The earliest Byzantine manuscript that we have in Greek is really from a 5th century manuscript known as Codex Alexandrinus. And you may have heard it called Codex A, but it's not fully Byzantine. It's actually a very unique manuscript. The Gospels are Byzantine, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the rest of the manuscript is what would be considered Alexandrian. So it's not completely Byzantine. And even then, in that manuscript, it's not completely Byzantine. For example, in that manuscript, the story of the woman caught in adultery would not fit into that missing section there in John's gospel. And the extensive research has been done on this, all those in the academic world that have studied this manuscript, and I have had to do some study on it myself. It does not fit. It does not fit there. And so what you have is the earliest witness of the Byzantine does not have the story of the woman caught in adultery, but that's really the earliest stage where we start seeing what's considered a Byzantine reading. And what needs to be stated, Marcus, is that the earliest Byzantine manuscript, like Alexandrinus, is not the same style of Byzantine in every place. You can see it develop more when you get into the 10th century. And then you have the Byzantine that's in the 13th and the 14th century. You start seeing that. And then they get broken into families. You have family 1 manuscripts in the Byzantine. You have family 13 manuscripts, family 35. You have different manuscripts. And what Dr. Ehrman brought out about these Byzantine manuscripts is that many and most are 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th century. So when a lot of the Byzantine majority text guys come in, Marcus, what they do is they'll say, well, the most manuscripts read this way. But what Dr. Ehrman tried to point out in the debate, and he's right about this, and I know that even Jonathan would concede here, that the Byzantine majority is not an accurate representation because almost all manuscripts we have, though we have many, are later. And so when we're trying to get back to the original reading, Dr. Ehrman and most textual critics, even in the evangelical side, are starting from the evidence of the earliest representations, which we know will be from 2 sources. The Alexandrian text types, so to speak, and again, I'm using that word very loosely because I wouldn't use that term anymore, just for the sake of the audience. There's an Alexandrian form or reading that survived due to the fact that, again, the weather preserved it, the sands preserved it. And the second argument of that is, how did the church fathers in different regions where those manuscripts would not have survived, how did they quote it? And when we look at those comparisons, and Dr. Ehrman has done extensive work on Origen and his quotes, it seems the earliest text represented more of what we find in the papyri and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But even then, there are differences in some of those readings. There are differences amongst themselves. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus have differences amongst themselves. Westcott and Hort had to deal with that. But that is basically the basic layout. The Western manuscripts, a lot of times those were diglots. They were a manuscript of Greek on one side, Latin on the other. And a lot of times the Latin influenced some of the Greek readings. And then you have that Byzantine priority, which is in the area of Constantinople. But those were much later, but they would say that they were copied from earlier sources. And we don't know how early, but nonetheless, that's pretty much the explanation. Hopefully that made sense.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Boyce. Yeah, I think then that was essentially what was argued by Dr. Ehrman. I think throughout his entire debate, then he goes on to argue that the majority isn't so to say reliable. I'm using the term loosely as well, as compared to the earlier manuscripts, because he mentioned like the Byzantine consists of about 94% of what we have. And then I think Jonathan then proceeded to argue for, I think, mainly the editorial process, if I'm not understanding him wrongly. So maybe we'll talk about, what do you think of his opening statement, Jonathan's statement?
Well, let me. You asked about the Peshitta too. I don't want to forget that. The Peshitta is Syriac. Now, there was kind of a slight debate between Dr. Ehrman and Jonathan in that. Jonathan kept saying second century. Ehrman kept saying fifth. Well, they're both right. It's believed that the Syriac, version of this, which is a translation, it was more of the second century when that would have been established in its original form. What we have of it is more fifth century, but it represents an earlier second century reading. Now, keep in mind, though, the Peshitta, though, a lot of the Byzantine priority or the ecclesiastical, which the ecclesiastical text is slightly different. The ecclesiastical text comes from the tradition of believing that the major churches that the apostles started were defending one text type reading. And so there's this purity that's been maintained, this protection and preservation that has been maintained through the church's text, the established text of the church. So that these other manuscripts, they would say, even Byzantine manuscripts would apply to this, but especially the manuscripts such as Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, or P66, P75, P45, P46, these other papyri, they would say, well, we don't know the provenance of these. We don't know who copied these. We don't know if they're reliable because the church didn't protect those. These were distributed texts to the public, and we don't know who established them. Whereas the ecclesiastical text, people would say, we know what the church has had, the tradition of being passed on, and they would use the Peshitta, part of that Syriac translation, being a part of the main churches that were started there. Now, what needs to be said about the Peshitta is that it did not have a full canon. It originally excluded books like 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, Revelation. It became a standard more so later around the 5th century, but it did not have all of the books that we would defend either. So it's nice to bring in the Byzantine. People would like to say, oh, yeah, the Peshitta reads a lot like the Byzantine. In places it does, but it doesn't fully express that either because it wasn't a complete New Testament in comparison to other places as well. So those things have to be taken into consideration, even in a translation like Syriac. We have old Latin manuscripts too, Latin manuscripts that go back earlier than some Greek. So these things have to be taken into consideration in textual criticism. Coptic has early down in Egypt as well. What did the Coptic church have? We know Mark went down to Egypt and became a bishop there. What was being distributed early on in John Mark's life as a bishop there? Those things have to be considered. They have to be looked at. And so these are the types of terms that they were throwing around in the debate.
All right. Thanks for clarifying that. So now, then, what do you think of Jonathan's opening statement then? Maybe
Who are you speaking to?
Maybe we'll have Sam this time. Let's just give Dr. Boyce some time to rest.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think his opening statement was really, really good. But again, it was part of the reason why some people struggle to understand that was, number one, due to the technicality. And number two, it was also due to the fact that, of course, Jonathan was reading it, which meant he was more monotonous. Unlike Dr. Ehrman, who was very animated in his presentation. And of course, the fact, as Stephen rightly pointed out, the lack of, for example, slides and presentation, which again, people, if you're watching at home, it's hard unless again you enjoy stuff like this a lot. You know a bit about this. You're able to process this, and you're able to keep track of where this is going. Otherwise, if this is new to you, the slides really do help. So, in that sense, you see a bit of a disadvantage for Jonathan right from the get-go due to these things. But I think Jonathan's presentation in terms of substance was phenomenal. I mean, the guy really, really, really prepared well. And again, this is not just something that I've noticed in the debate. I knew he was preparing hard for this before the debate. So his opening presentation, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but he prepared really, really hard and presented a lot of evidence as to why, for example, the Byzantine text was not the Byzantine text and the Syriac were not secondary in origin, that they were reliable from the get-go. But I think this is something that Stephen was going to point out. And again, we do have video clips as well that we want to show. So I think Stephen should be the one to take this even further.
Right. Yeah. I think Dr. Stephen, Dr. Boyce, you've mentioned that you wanted to talk about some of the things that Dr. Ehrman said, particularly on one of them was when Dr. Ehrman mentioned that none of the early church fathers actually quote the Byzantine text. I believe that was the part of the debate that you wanted to talk about as well.
Yeah, we could play the clip for that and just so people could see it. But I will say, I agree with Dr. Ehrman. I do think the Byzantine text is secondary. I think it is expansion of what would have been the earliest forms of the text. That's the big debate. Did the scribes eliminate or did they add? I know that came up at one point where Jonathan made the argument that the process to add is not typically the standard, it's to eliminate. We know of examples where that's not true. And Dr. Ehrman didn't spend much time on that because I think as a textual critic himself, he knows not even to entertain that very much. The tendency to subtract is always there. And there's no doubt that subtraction happened in transmission. Somebody skipped a line, somebody missed a section, or their manuscript was not readable in a place. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why omission would happen. But it does seem that the tendency to add would be more recognizable. For example, I'll give you one example. If there was a marginal note, and if you look at manuscripts like Sinaiticus, for example, there's more than one writer. There's the original scribe, a second scribe, and a third scribe. You have correctors who went in. And a lot of times corrections happened on manuscripts and you're copying from one and you have to make the decision. All right, so which scribe do I go with? The original hand and did the second hand know something that the first hand did not know? And so do I include it or do I exclude it? You have to make choices even in transmission. For example, in John chapter 5, verse 4, you have this story about an angel coming down and touching the waters and stirring it. And the first person that makes it in, hallelujah, he's healed, he feels better. There's marginal notes of that story in manuscript. And so the question is, how did that make it in the text? Is it a true statement? Is that what the Jews probably believed? It seems very likely that the Jews actually did believe that about John, that John was talking about, that there was some supernatural thing happening like an angel came down. That was probably a tradition. Well, later scribe would have marginalized that statement, letting them know some commentary. Well, here's the problem. You put that in the margin off to the side, letting the reader know, here's why they would have done that. The scribe after him doesn't know that. You have a choice to make. It's like, oh, wait, is that a part of the text or is that a commentary? And the rule of the scribe would have been in a situation like that, put it in. If you don't know, put it in. It's better safe than sorry. So expansion could happen like that. And we know it wasn't an angel that was stirring the waters. They tore that up later in archaeology. And it appears that there was some sort of spring under the ground that was causing the water to bubble and things like that. They thought it was an angel. So the question is was it traditionally true and did John write it? The likelihood is, no, John didn't write that. Some scribe inserted that to give commentary about why the Jews believed that, and scribes after that inserted into the text. That's the likelihood. So Dr. Ehrman would agree that the tendency was actually expansion. And in fact, if you look at the manuscripts from the 2nd century, 3rd, 4th, 5th, all the way up to the 14th, you know what grows? The number of words. Now that's not a standard. That's not a rule. That doesn't mean, that answers all the questions. That solves all the puzzle problems of textual variances. That's not what that means. But if you read the charts, look at the 2nd century jump to the 6th, 7th century, and then jump to the 12th and 13th century, there's more words in the New Testament. It seems that expansion was more likely. So with that being said, even Byzantine examples like Codex Alexandrinus, which I mentioned earlier, the earliest Byzantine readings, which end up just in the Gospels, as I stated, the woman caught in adultery is not in that manuscript, but it's in most Byzantine manuscripts. So it's not in the earliest, but it's in almost all of the manuscripts of the Byzantine family later on, or at least portions of it. So again, what's the tendency? It looks like expansion. I would say it is secondary in its value. That doesn't mean it's not important. And that doesn't mean we don't study them and look at the data and the different families. They should be noted. But I do think it's secondary, just to agree with Dr. Ehrman on that. But I do disagree with what he said in one of his statements. If you want to play the clip, we'll talk about it.
So this is going to be clip number 1, which is it's actually the opening statement of Bart Ehrman, right?
Yes.
You're looking at, right? So I'll just pull this up real quick. Here we go.
So there, one way that textual scholars go about deciding what the oldest form of the text is, or what the original text was, is they've got these manuscripts, of course, but they wonder, well, is there some other evidence? And yes, church fathers, starting in the 2nd century, started quoting the New Testament, and they quoted a lot. Some of them quoted a whole lot. And what's striking is the church fathers in the 2nd and the 3rd and the early 4th century never quote the Byzantine text in the text.
All right, pause right there. Pause right there.
You can make.
Okay, there's the comment. I was thrown off a little bit by this statement, and if you want to back out, Samuel, that's the only thing on that. I was taken back by the statement because Dr. Ehrman has studied the fathers far more than I ever have. I just so happen to be doing a lot of the 2nd century fathers in my dissertation work out of Codex H. And so I was a little bit surprised to hear him say that. And I maybe we all misunderstood him. Maybe he meant something slightly different, but it seemed like, and Samuel, you were moderating this, it came up a couple of times. It seemed like he was saying all quotations were not Byzantine, not most or the standard. Because I would agree with that. Most were not. And many of them were more in relation to papyri or earlier witnesses than later Byzantine. But how did you interpret that before I jump in?
So could you repeat that point again? Because I was pulling up the next video earlier. So go ahead.
How dare you? So on the section on, he said all the 2nd century fathers, none of them quoted any Byzantine, things like that. I didn't know how to interpret that at first, but it sounds like he's saying that there was 0 Byzantine readings being quoted by any 2nd century father, rather than saying most or almost none or something like that. How did you?
No, you're absolutely right. He actually went on to say that none of them, if I understood him correctly, none of them actually quoted that. He goes through this list. Actually, if you actually play the video, he goes through this list where he gives Irenaeus, or he just goes on that list, goes on and on and on. And at the end, he actually says, pick your father. None of them actually quote this. So, I mean, if he's saying pick your father, what he's trying to mean is that no matter which father you pick, none of them are actually citing the Byzantine manuscript. So that's what I understood him to mean in that period.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, because I wanted to pull this up. I snatched a few readings out of the 2nd century, or in my opinion, the Didache would have been late 1st century. And by the way, just for clarity, Dr. Ehrman inspired me to do the dissertation that I'm doing. The discussion and series that he did on the 2nd century and 3rd century fathers, going over a lot of the readings that we have right here, motivated me and brought me into this manuscript in Jerusalem called Codex H, which contains 1st, 2nd Clement, Epistle of Barnabas, 7 letters of Ignatius, which Ignatius came up a few times, which was very important. The Didache, those kinds of readings came up in the discussion. but it also was something Dr. Ehrman brought me onto in watching and listening to some of his lectures that I had to do for class. And it inspired me to do my dissertation on that manuscript. And so what I've done is I've done the comparative work in the manuscripts here. Like this is the Didache, chapter 1, verse 3. You have a phrase here, and if you see, this is the Byzantine majority text. This is our Nestle-Nolan 28. This would be closer to that Alexandrian, if you would, or it'd be closer related to the early papyri and Vaticanus and Atticus. So just keep that in mind. That's more representative of the earliest texts. Byzantine is that majority text that we talked about, which is slightly different from the TR. The TR has its own problematic readings, as you know, Dr. White and I have done an entire session on this show on. But this is the Byzantine majority text, the consensus of those Byzantine manuscripts. So you have this phrase here that we're all familiar with from Matthew 5:44, to bless those that curse you, pray for your enemies, fast for them for that persecute you. So there's a few differences there in that quote, but the Didache, which is claimed to be the 12 apostles, which is not likely, is at the end of the 1st century, but it is Orthodox. It's an Orthodox document. And if you notice this, it is clear the Didache is following the words of Jesus from Matthew 5:44. The agreement is solid in most places. It is closer connected to the Byzantine tradition of the verse, given the statement, and here it is, bless those who curse you. Now, if you were go to the critical text, you would find that statement is lacking. Now, I don't know if you can see me highlight it. Can you see this highlighted right here?
Yep.
Okay. Notice that in the older manuscripts, the better manuscripts and the consensus of those manuscripts in the Nestle-Nolan 28th or even in 27th, for that matter, any of them, do not have the phrase to bless those that curse you. That is a Byzantine reading that is in the Byzantine tradition, not represented by the better and earlier manuscripts that Dr. Ehrman was talking about. So that's important. Same verse in Polycarp, in his epistle to the Philippians in chapter 12. Now, here's the thing. You say, Stephen, that doesn't look like Greek. You're right. It doesn't. It's Latin. Because what we have of Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians, which we'll talk more about in a minute, which came at the end, you have to understand, we don't have an entire manuscript that survived of it. We have 3 ways to compile this text. And this is why, if you listen very carefully, Dr. Ehrman mentioned that there's a possibility that there are 2. That we don't know if it's 1 or 2. Well, why did he say that? Well, because we have Greek readings of the manuscript that survived, and it's later. And then there's a missing section. But we have Latin to fill in that missing section. And then we have Eusebius and how he quoted it to fill in some missing sections. So between the Latin, the Greek manuscript we have, and Eusebius, scholars believe we have reconstructed the epistle, or most of the epistle and then part of a different one or a second one. I happen to believe we've reconstructed one epistle, but I'm willing to change my view on that. Now, here's what we're going to have to do here. If you notice, this is the Vulgate that I put here, which is Latin, which came up quite a bit. This is Jerome's compilation. But in Polycarp's epistle to Philippians, which is early to mid 2nd century, you have the Latin readings here, which are translated from what Polycarp's Greek would have been. So this is later. So now we got to back translate. So stay with me. We're looking at a translation of Polycarp now, not a transmitted Greek text. But this reading here is important to note, because this reading, and if you notice, I went ahead and just inserted biz, not because this Latin word is Byzantine. The Byzantine isn't Latin, it's Greek. But I'm letting you know that this reading here is the same word that's not in the critical edition. Now, in Matthew 5:44, you have the agreement of the word for them that persecute and hate. So Polycarp appears to borrow the term from the same verse that we just looked at in the Didache, Matthew 5:44. And if this statement is true, he is borrowing from a more Byzantine reading, since that phrase right here is lacking in the critical text. It does not talk about the ending here in the critical text. So taking the Latin and back translating it into Greek, it's not in the critical text, but this phrase is in the Byzantine text. So again, there's a Byzantine reading. So when Dr. Ehrman had made the statement, I'm going to show you one more that's even bigger than that. When Dr. Ehrman had made the statement that we do not have any fathers quoting from the Byzantine, if we're talking about the story of the woman caught in adultery, yeah, okay, I agree. If we're talking about certain readings like John 5:4, yeah, we agree. But if we're talking about phrases, and this is why maybe Dr. Ehrman, if he were here today, could clarify this and solve all of our problems. You do have phrases like bless those who curse you that did not show up in the earliest forms, but they are showing up the late first century in the Didache. I'll give you one more back to the Didache, chapter number 8, verse 2. This is a big one. He's praying in this Matthew 6 prayer that we know that the Lord taught. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. And we know in the earliest manuscripts that the longer ending of the prayer is not in those earliest forms. For yours is the, now it's not here, the basileia. Now notice this, I put it in blue for you. And kingdom, that's the word kingdom. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. That long ending to the Lord's Prayer is not in the earliest manuscripts that Dr. Ehrman would defend and say are the best. So would I. That's in Matthew 6:13. But that phrase, even though the Didache does not quote the kingdom there, it does read yours is the power and the glory forever and ever, which is exactly what you find right here. Dunamis kai e doxa esus enos. So aeonos, excuse me. And so, or ionos, excuse me. And then you have in this reading an amazing thing. Byzantine. That's what you have. Byzantine. So why is that important? Because the longer ending is a Byzantine reading of the Lord's Prayer. And here's the Didache. And by the way, it quotes this 3 times, not once. It quotes this phrase. Now, granted, it is missing basileia. It is missing the kingdom. It's not in the quote. But that entire long ending is in the Byzantine text. So when Dr. Ehrman had made comment about that, it kind of confused me a little bit that he said that so broadly. If he was talking about as a standard or as a whole, I would agree with Dr. Ehrman, but he almost made it sound like every reading was not Byzantine. And there's an example just in the Didache and Polycarp's epistle. And there's others. I could go through Clement where he chooses 2 words that are Byzantine over what's in our in Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, or in P75. There's times they're quoting manuscripts from the West as well, like readings from Codex D that are only found in Codex D. There's times where they're quoting from, like Dr. Ehrman said, the earliest papyri. There's readings in the Didache that are aligned with P46 and only P46. And so there are times where you see that the earliest forms of the fathers, 1 minute they're quoting a Western reading. The next minute they're quoting a papyri reading. The next minute they're quoting a Byzantine reading. And then the next minute they're right back to quoting an Alexandrian reading. But as a standard, he is correct. Dr. Ehrman would say it is not a Byzantine text that they're quoting. He's right. But you do see Byzantine readings like the ones I just showed you.
Okay. Right. Thanks, Dr. Stephen. Sam, you want to add anything to that? Otherwise, I have another follow-up.
No, I think that, I think that we want to talk about more of the historical stuff versus the textual stuff as far as the debate was concerned. But I guess we can do that a little bit later on. But I think, what his explanation, I think, would suffice as far as that section is concerned. Right.
So I think following up from that, I think if I'm not mistaken, this was one of the things that Jonathan sort of mentioned that, if I may paraphrase, is that Dr. Ehrman might be not seeing certain things in history, and especially when we talk about the transmission of the text, that I think Jonathan was sort of mentioning that Dr. Ehrman might have missed out on some things that that would possibly be evidence that that the Byzantine text actually has accurate information?
I think I'm just going to quickly chip in before Stephen explains this, but I think as far as the historical stuff is concerned, and this is what I meant earlier, I think Jonathan had a slight advantage there. And I don't know. I think you would agree with me, Stephen, on that point. As far as, for example, that Jonathan was explaining the historical stuff of it, because in my understanding, okay, and again, textual criticism is not my field. That's why I'm letting Stephen do most of the talking as far as the textual criticism is concerned. But in my understanding, sometimes, Dr. Bart Ehrman, expert in the field, can get a little bit broad on his statements. Someone was just saying in the live chat earlier, his copies is getting a little bit tiring by now. But that said, he can be a little bit broad. He can make just general statements in a sense. And I think that Stephen was right to point out, for example, that this could, if we understand him correctly, we are hoping we don't misinterpret him. But if we understand him accurately, this seems to be an area where he can be proven wrong. But as long as Jonathan stuck with the historical part, he was doing really well. It's only when he gets to the textual part, this is where Ehrman is at his best. And I think that was something that Stephen and I spoke about. And I just wonder whether, Stephen, you want to expand a little bit on that.
No, I think you're right. I go back to the fact that Jonathan feels like he won the debate on the fact that he pushed Dr. Ehrman back to the consensus of scholars. Like, if you notice, that came up frequently. Well, he would say, you do realize that's not the consensus of scholars. Or he would talk about, what year was that evidence put together, Jonathan? And I'm sure that irritated Jonathan a little bit, because it was a consensus at one point. Now, it may need to be updated. But Jonathan felt like he was able to bring early attestation for his position that was just excused on consensus, not so much on the data. And so, in a way, because of what you said, Samuel, the broad statements that were made, that I'm confident if time limits weren't of an issue, Dr. Ehrman would explain all of it. Yeah, I don't think it's because he doesn't know. But that is one of the things that I've noticed about Dr. Ehrman in every lecture I've ever taken from him. The vast majority of scholars, or the consensus of scholars, are most in the educated field. And it's kind of like, and he even writes in his books that way sometimes. And it's like, well, it's the consensus of unbelieving scholars at times. Now, not in every case. I won't belittle him in that way. He works with both believing and unbelieving scholars. But a lot of times he does that. Now, if you took the time and say, well, who are these people? I'm sure he'd have a long line item of list names for you. But I feel like in a debate setting, Jonathan brought specific quotes, statements, or assessments or data, whether it was outdated or whether it was something that was once held, no longer completely held. And it was quickly swept away by vast majority of scholars, consensus of scholars, and his broad answer would probably be able to specifically answer Jonathan, but his broad answer looked like he didn't answer Jonathan. So on that level, Jonathan actually ended up would be considered winning that part of the debate because he went specific. Dr. Ehrman went broad.
And I think that was one point just to add on. I think that I'm not sure who the guy that Jonathan quoted. Was it Miller or something like that? He quotes him, and Dr. Ehrman just quickly asks him, when did he come up with that scholarship? Yeah. And immediately Jonathan says that, well, he came up with that in the late 1800s. And Ehrman just leaves it at there. It's almost like the point has already been made, a mic drop moment. So in that part, I think what Ehrman is trying to do is to show current scholarship favors him. But again, the area where I'm actually working on at the moment is more towards the deity of Christ, and which is also an area that Dr. Ehrman has done a bit of work on. But for example, you hear the statements that most scholars don't believe this, and most scholars don't accept Second Peter as something that Second Peter actually wrote. Most scholars don't believe that John wrote the book of Revelation. We kind of heard that in the debate as well. But you've got to wonder what you mean by, first of all, scholars, and what do you mean by most? Who are these scholars you're talking about? And again, this kind of broad categorize, I'm sure if given a time, as you said, he'll be able to define what that means. But for example, most of those scholars, for example, wouldn't accept the fact that God even exists, perhaps, and some of the people that would actually do, he may not even consider them to be scholars. So I guess it's a bit subjective when you use the word most scholars without actually defining them. That was one thing that I noticed, for example. So
yeah, and some of the struggles that you brought up, Second Peter, Revelation, not being John. This is where the ecclesiastical guys will come in and say, now, wait a minute. The churches that were started by John said it was him. Irenaeus said it was him. There's numerous aspects to where Jerome acknowledged it as him. You're talking about the churches that the apostles started. They're all assessing it back to John the apostle. Now, the question that has to be asked, the other side of that is Dr. Ehrman's statement. The Greek in John is not the same Greek in Revelation. He is right. Eusebius wrestled with this. He assumed that he assumed there were two Johns. There was John the Apostle, and then this John the Elder.
Yeah.
And so there was much Revelation was completely disputed for a lot of reasons. But some of this is simple to understand if we can accept the reality that the original apostles did not always do the penman work. 1 Peter, 2 Peter, same situation. You mentioned 2 Peter. Why do people struggle with 2 Peter? A lot of reasons. One of which, 1 Peter and 2 Peter, the Greek syntax is very different.
Completely different, yeah.
But if we can understand that these writers used amanuensis to do a lot of the work, or secretary to do their work, you see in the end of 1 Peter, it wasn't Peter that was writing it.
Well, Silas.
It was Silvanus who was
Silvanus or Silas, yeah.
Silas or Savannah, same guy.
Yeah.
And we already know that Mark wrote Peter's gospel for him. So why is that? My personal belief, Peter was illiterate. I don't think Peter had the ability to write. I don't think he was given. He was a fisherman. Most fishermen were not. I think he knew scripture. I think most Jews went off memorization. It's not new to me to think about the idea of, hey, these guys use scribes to write their oral teachings. And so when you look at it, that understand it's easy to be understood, or Revelation, like you were talking about. I think later John may have learned how to write. I mean, he had a longer chance to live. And if you look at a lot of the Greek, it's very elementary. It's possible he had an amanuensis for one, and he took on the role of doing it, or he used an amanuensis that was elementary or just totally different styled in writing what he was told. There's explanations, is all I'm saying. You can consensus everything away, but there are explanations to why the Greek syntax would be different from the Gospel of John. That doesn't solve the problem. It should be noted, but I don't think that just answers everything. There's no point in having a discussion. But I agree with you, Samuel.
Yeah, one of the other things, Marcus, that I felt that was really interesting in the context of speaking about broad statements is that Dr. Ehrman, if I understood him correctly, again said, we cannot know what the original was. If I understood him correctly, this is what he's saying. We cannot know what the original was. And at the same time, I think that would be a defeater against the idea that, for example, him believing that the Byzantine text or the Byzantine text forms, the Syriac and the Peshitta and all that was secondary in nature. Because if you don't know what the original is, how do you judge what is primary and what is secondary? So again, I'm sure he would be able to explain that. But again, this is an example of the broad statements he was making. And I think Jonathan did well to call him out on a few of these occasions.
Jonathan did call him on that. And I think that was one of his strengths in the debate.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay. Thanks, gentlemen. Another thing I just want to ask also, it's I think Dr. Boyce, you mentioned also about Polycarp just now, and I noticed that Dr. Ehrman mentions about Romans 3 verse 12. He sort of talks about it, asks his students to check it up, and I sort of looked it up, and I think there might be a lot of confusion for people who don't really understand what Dr. Ehrman was trying to say or trying to assert by that. So maybe if you like us to pull up the clip and you sort of explain it.
Sure.
Shall we put up the clip now?
This is the third clip, right? The one on Polycarp,
Yeah.
your question in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay. Give me 1 second to pull that up. This exactly is why I do it earlier, but here goes. It's from. Let me pull this up. Okay. Right. Share screen. It's from Dr. Stephen Boyce. He says, Polycarp said in chapter 3 of his epistle to the Philippians, and when absent from you, he, Paul, wrote you a letter, which if you carefully study, you will find a means of building you up in that faith which has been given to you. Polycarp was early to mid-2nd century, and it appears that he assumes the church at Philippi still had the letter and could study it. What are your thoughts about that with the theory of copies of copies of copies, as if the church lost these readings, or potentially lost these readings, or lost control of the text?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, but I think I disagree with the premise a little bit. I sometimes will say to my students, okay, you got your New Testament, so you've got your letter of the Romans. Look it up. What does he say in chapter 3, verse 12? I say you've got the letter to the Romans. I don't mean they have the original copy. And so when Polycarp tells the Philippians, you've got Paul's letter, of course they had Paul's letter, but it doesn't mean that they're basing it on. He's not saying they may have the original. Part of it has to do with when Polycarp lived. I mean, he's usually thought to have died around the year 155. There's a debate about his letter and about whether his letter is one letter or two letters and how they date and all that. But however you count it, at earliest, he said that about 70 years after the original of, more like 80 years after the original of Philippians. Is it likely that 80 years after the original, the church is still using only the original? I'd say absolutely not.
All right, pull back right there. So here's the interesting dynamic of that. And by the way, I've waited over a year to ask him that question. So I'm glad that Samuel snuck it in. And so what needs to be said about that is Polycarp, again, who are we talking about? We're talking about Polycarp, who was directly trained under John, the apostle. He's writing to the church at Philippi that was started by Paul. Go to Acts. And here they are, and he's right, 70 or 80 years later, depending on where you put Polycarp's epistle, 125 to 150. He was probably killed around 155. I think the epistle was probably somewhere between 130 and 140. Okay, let's just say that. Philippians was written in the early 60s of the first century. 70, 80 years, in that range. He made the statement that they may have had the original, and he used an illustration of why that's not a good premise. Now, I was flattered. He said it was a great question. He said that it was from a different premise, and he used the illustration that you brought up, Marcus, about the student. If I tell my students to go to Romans 3:12, go to the Epistle of the Romans, they have the Epistle of the Romans, but I'm not saying they have the original. Here's the difference. The church that Polycarp was saying that to was the church that had the original letter sent to them 70 or 80 years prior versus a classroom student body at the University of Chapel Hill in the year 2020 holding the book of Romans that they have no association with at all, and they're 2,000 years almost removed from the letter of the Romans. The contrast, the comparison there is not in the same ballpark. You're talking about Polycarp, an official agent of the church at Smyrna, who was left there by John, writing to the existing church within a lifetime of Paul, who started that church, saying, read the letter to the Philippians read the letter that he wrote to you, the Philippians, comparing that to a student body opening their copy of the book of Romans in 2020. I mean, come on, I think Dr. Ehrman is a tremendous scholar, way above mine, but come on. I mean, that's not a good comparison. I think that's not a good comparison at all. And he even said it may have been the original. Or hear what he said. But then he said, would it be likely? Absolutely not. Why? Papyri lasted for 100 to 130, 120 years. It's within the realm of possibility from the life expectancy of a manuscript. Now, again, I'm not saying that they had the original. I'm not saying that. I think I wouldn't say absolutely not, just from the papyri lifespan. And this is the argument that Jonathan Sheffield was making, is that the churches were protecting the scripture. Most of what we have that has survived are copies of what would have been from the autograph or from the manuscript. It's possible that the church at Philippi had a second generation copy, and the original wore out from copying it and sending it out. Here's another thing that Dr. Ehrman makes a mistake in my opinion. He conflates the idea of original text with original autograph. Mm-hmm. The original text and the original autograph do not have to be the same thing. If you have the original autograph and you copy it word for word on another codex, that is still the original text. It's not the original autograph, but you still have the original text. And listen, these people that were receiving the letters from the apostles were holding them very, very closely. We know that through how they were quoted. We know that from how they were referenced. Again, Polycarp quoted from the Philippians, the book of Philippians, to the church at Philippi. You look at Clement. He was quoting from the New Testament. You realize Clement alone in 1 Clement, who was trained by Paul, he's mentioned in the book of Philippians, and he became a bishop in Rome. He references Old and New Testament together almost 100 times, over 100 times in one epistle. And he was accurately quoting the Old, which seems to be he was quoting from the Septuagint, the Old Testament, and he was quoting from the manuscript that he had of different books, and like Matthew and Mark and Luke. And he was quoting from 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. These guys were accurately quoting the same text that we have today. Were there textual variances? Yes, of course there were. I just showed you examples on the screen. And you know what those variances are? The same ones we have today. They're not new variances. They're the same variances we know of in our own manuscript tradition. These guys were dealing with it from the very start. But to assume if you do not have the original autograph that you no longer have the original text is a faulty assumption, because the churches took care of these texts. When people were moving and Marcion got brought up, Marcion started corrupting the Gospel of Luke. He started editing it, also Paul's epistles. The churches noted it quickly. How did they know that? They were comparing it to the text they already had. That's Jonathan's argument of the ecclesiastical. Now, I don't think it defends an ecclesiastical text, because I don't think we know what those manuscripts exactly said that were in Rome, in Antioch. Jonathan would say we probably do. I would say we don't. I would say that they had a manuscript that accurately represents what we do have now. But to assume copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and then to turn around and say, well, the early 2nd century fathers quoted a different text from the Byzantine, which I agree. Mm-hmm. But that instance that I asked in the question, Samuel, was very specific. I asked about the theory of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. That's all we have. That, by his own statement, by him even saying it may have been the original, completely eliminates that possibility right there. I don't believe that the Philippians had copies of copies of copies of copies of copies when they were the original church that received the original letter, and Polycarp 80 years later saying, go read the letter Paul wrote, and in doing so your faith will be increased. That he was referring to some, like, they lost control of the manuscript. They don't know what it said. Keep in mind, Samuel, and then you can jump in on this, a lot of the manuscripts were controlled by not a single person, but communities. If you had an original writer, and Timothy Mitchell has done extensive work in Myths and Mistakes of New Testament textual criticism on this. Timothy Mitchell has done a wonderful job of writing about this in his own blogs and in that book, of showing that early first century writers did not just write a manuscript, send it out to the public to take over, because once it leaves your possession, I mean, it's a free for all. And then he has, no control. While that writer is alive, he still has control of the text. And while his amanuensis is alive, he has control of the text, because he does have the original text, and he could have. And it's very likely that the original writers were not sending out a manuscript of the original autograph. They were sending out manuscripts. Think about it. The original writer would have kept a copy for himself. He would have distributed one to the church, and likely distributed multiple copies to the church and had them send it on. We see in Colossians, Paul wrote to them and said, when you're done, take this letter to the church at Laodicea and read it to them. They were passing them on. But it is likely that when Paul was writing a letter to the Philippians, other churches were also getting it off of the manuscript that Paul had. I believe Paul kept his own original autograph as a point of reference as much as any of his amanuenses would have. So there would have been numerous manuscripts representing the original text. It may not have been the first one that Paul wrote on, and they were controlling it. So when a community had the original text, they were controlling any additional changes. We see this all the way to the time of Jerome. Jerome was writing through the Psalms. Here's a guy on the other side of the sea who is corrupting Jerome's work. Some guy hundreds of miles away was like, hey, that's not what Jerome said. He wrote back to Jerome and said, somebody's corrupting your commentaries. And Jerome responded. Why? The communities were helping control the texts. And we see that early on in the first, second, third centuries of the churches. And for me to be within 100 years of the original autograph written to the church at Philippi, to believe that they have just completely lost what the reading of Paul was, and they have no control over its reading. And Polycarp's like, well, maybe you still have it, but if you do, check and dust, see if it's there. No, Polycarp assumed they had that letter, whether it was the original or a second addition to it. He assumed they had it. They could still read it and understand what Paul had said, and their lives and their spiritual faith could be changed by it. Samuel, sorry that was long, but
No.
Come in.
Not at all. Not at all. I just wanted to just add on to what you said. And for example, we do see a good example of that in the book of Revelation, where, for example, it's written to the 7 churches. It's unlikely that John would have been sending one and expecting that church to pass it on. It's very likely he would have written to all 7 churches at the same time. So you have 7 original manuscripts, or 7 autographs, rather, if you're considering it's coming from John, it's the autograph being sent out at the same time. So yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with Stephen on that. And I feel that since, I think basically to sum up, there's nothing I can add on to what Stephen said. He's the expert in the field. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. I think that would also give credibility to what Dr. Boyce said just now, that the churches that John the Apostle himself started, they affirm that the book of Revelations by the Apostle John himself. Would that be the case for the book of Revelation?
Can you repeat that? I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're asking.
Because you mentioned that it was the churches that the Apostle John started that were the ones who were affirming that the book of Revelations was authored by John. And so with the distribution of the letter of Revelation to the 7 churches, would that sort of fit what you said?
Are you talking about earlier when I said that the later fathers?
I think what he's asking is, for example, do we have evidences that the church in Asia Minor affirm that these letters were from John, since the letters were originally sent out to the seven churches. Would those churches at least, do we have any record of those churches affirming that this letter was from Paul? Sorry,
Yeah, I mean,
from John, rather, from John.
yeah, I mean, you got guys like Irenaeus who were disciples of Polycarp, and Irenaeus is one of the first to talk about the book of Revelation being from John. And in fact, he says it was while he was put on the island and marooned, pretty much. And in fact, Domitian was the emperor that he referenced. That Revelation would have been written around that time. It wasn't during Nero's reign. There's a lot of debate with the preterists and all that, or even the semi-preterists about all the books of the New Testament being written before 70 AD. I think it's ridiculous. The earliest attestations of the book of Revelation have placed it at the end of the first century, including John trained Polycarp. Polycarp trains Irenaeus. Irenaeus said that he knows that it was written during the reign of Domitian within our lifetime, is what he said. And so he knew a man who knew John. And so you do see that semi carried out. Like, there's credibility there. You have a guy who knew the guy. I don't know my great grandfather on my dad's side, but I've heard a lot about him from my grandfather because he did know him. So that means more to me than some 20th century or 21st century guy who has an opinion or even a presupposition in his eschatological view to place Revelation before 70 AD so that everything looks like it's been completed, when all of the earliest attestations of the fathers up to Jerome all said that this happened during the Domitian's reign at the end of the first century. So yeah, with that being said, you do have early witnesses attached to John's church planting and apostleship who are affirming him as the writer of Revelation, who knew John. So I would say that brings credibility into the equation.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks for that.
and by the way, Jonathan Sheffield is in the live chat right now, and I realize that he's just said, Tertullian and Irenaeus say the Church of Asia Minor say that the churches in Asia Minor say it was from John. Just to confirm what you just said.
Exactly. Yeah, Tertullian would have as well. Again, I mean, no one said differently up till later. I mean, it became a secondary opinion much later than these guys. And again, if we're going to ask ourselves, should we take the consensus of scholarship? Well, let's take a consensus today, but what was the consensus within 100 years of all this? The consensus would have said John wrote it, or at least he authored it. And it was during this time and this time at this event and that event. And those guys seem to all be on the same page. So that is where Jonathan has a stronger view. This is where the ecclesiastical text view is valuable. And so I am not ecclesiastical text. I don't think that the ecclesiastical text can substantiate the full argument of textual criticism, as I feel like we saw during the debate. But it does have value because the churches are telling us. In fact, Dr. Ehrman said it in the debate. We don't give credit enough and don't pay enough attention to the fathers. Now, I'm afraid if we start doing that and we take Dr. Ehrman's advice, we might find out that Dr. Ehrman has a couple of facts wrong, which is what Jonathan Sheffield was trying to call him on in some of those ways. So, we need to take heed to that. And again, that doesn't make them infallible. That doesn't make Irenaeus infallible. Tertullian had issues, man. I mean, that dude had serious issues. And if Jonathan Sheffield is in the comment section, he can affirm what I'm saying. Tertullian had issues, but it doesn't mean we ignore him either.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Boyce. I also want to talk about the another thing that Dr. Ehrman mentioned, which was since we're on the topic of the early church fathers, he talked about Origen, and he mentioned that I can't really remember exactly what was it that, but he's sort of mentioning that Origen didn't quote the Byzantine form, if I'm not mistaken. There was something along the lines, you say, related to Jerome as well. So would you like to share your thoughts on that as well?
So this is where they got into the discussion on slide 2. Samuel, if you want to go ahead and play that.
Sure, I'll play that and I'll skip to the exact part. And for those of you watching, I would try to play this a little bit louder than the last time. So,
Did Jonathan answer me? Did Jonathan answer me about Tertullian?
Not. I don't think he answered you, but he said that Irenaeus was a monatist. So yeah, that's the only answer.
No, it wouldn't be Irenaeus. It'd be Tertullian.
Yeah, that's what he said. Yeah, Tertullian.
Yeah, Tertullian was. Yeah, so he agrees with me. All right.
Oh no, wait. I'm sorry. I'm not sure. He may be referring to Irenaeus. I'm not sure. But
no, he's referring. No, that's Tertullian. He's talking about Tertullian.
Could be.
It's Tertullian.
Right. I mean, yeah. So anyway, we'll play this. We'll play this clip. And let me skip to the part where I think it really got to the point that you wanted to emphasize. So
I mean, it seemed like I was more arguing on my side than you. But okay, so I don't have much time, so I want to ask something else. You talk about Jerome, and of course, Jerome was very much involved with the debates over Origen. Now, Origen, I think you would agree, Origen was probably the greatest biblical scholar in the first 3 centuries. At least he's generally seen that way. Could you tell us something about Origen's text of the New Testament? He looked into manuscripts just like Jerome did, and he talks about the oldest manuscript. So can you tell us what Origen's form of the text was?
Well, and once again, Origen does quote heavily, and I think Reisbach indicated this as well. He leans with that older form of the text. Now, the problem I have with Origen, and once again, he has done some great works against Celsius. He's done some good pieces, but we do have to take in consideration his methodology, that he was actually thrown out of Alexandria by his bishop.
Not because of his biblical interpretation, or not because of his text criticism.
Well,
I don't know if you know this book. So I wrote a book on Origen's text for the New Testament with Gordon Fee and Mike Holmes, both of whom you mentioned. We collected every quotation of Origen of the Gospel of John. This book is it's about 500 pages long, and we cited every reference of Origen's quotations of John. So Origen is writing, say, early 3rd century. He dies in the 250s, and he's in Alexandria. And by far, his closest associations are with Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, P75, and P66. Has almost no connections with the Byzantine text. So, I mean, you know, you did mention this study by Miller. So, when that study was done?
Yeah, no, that was done in the late 1800s.
Based on Bergen's work.
Right, I just thought I'll play the end of that so that because that was the part I was referring to earlier as well. But go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so this is the amazing thing. I don't know if anybody else noticed this, and kudos to Jonathan, where Jerome kind of just got skipped over. Dr. Ehrman didn't spend much time on Jerome. He quickly went to Origen, which I love the fact that he asked Jonathan Sheffield, tell us about Origen's New Testament. Jonathan is not a fan of Origen. So that was probably painstaking for him to give a compliment about him, even in his work against Celsius. And so I'm sure that Jonathan, in all of his rage, held himself back and even had to work up the audacity to give a compliment to Origen. And so, but again, here's what we know about Origen. He was a textual critic. What he did, he compared manuscripts, not just in the New Testament, the hexaplat of the Old Testament that he had as well, of books like Job. Dr. John Mead has done extensive work on his hexaplat of places in Job. He also did New Testament work. Now, think about this for a minute. Origen was doing textual criticism at the beginning of the 200s. 100, 150 years after the originals. He was dealing with the evidence. and Dr. Ehrman is correct, most of his readings would have been closer to the papyri or to a Vaticanus or a Sinaiticus. But we also know that Origen's terminology and quotations of the New Testament slightly changed when his move went into Caesarea. So he did come across manuscripts of variances. So here's the thing, we can't think, well, Origen quoted Alexandrian. Well, most of the time that would be the case, but keep in mind, not all Alexandrian readings read the same or agree all the time. But Jerome, on the other hand, Jerome was also interested in textual criticism. Now, he came years later, and we have to remember this about Jerome. He was sent on a mission to accomplish a universal Bible for the churches in Latin, which we know as the Vulgate. And he had extensive funding and supply, and he was given numerous elements to documentation. He sent teams all over the world. He interviewed, he went down and dealt with Didymus the blind, which they talked about briefly there. Dr. Ehrman actually did, it sounds like, extensive work in his doctoral work on Didymus the blind. So he would have interviewed these guys. He interviewed the churches, the Jewish churches, and tried to understand the Apocrypha. I mean, he sent teams out there and did extensive work. Now, Jonathan is correct that Origen was expelled by his bishop. So again, for a guy like Jonathan, that's a big deal because, again, the churches are protecting the data. The churches, the ecclesiastical churches, are the source of authority and preservation. So if the bishop is kicking you out, that means you're not trustworthy. Now, this is where Jonathan and I differ. I don't think that means anything to me. I think it's interesting. Origen had some weird thoughts. For example, Origen believed that, the people that even go to hell, they'll go and serve their sentence, and it's almost like purification. They'll serve their sentence until all their evil is paid and purified. Then they're led into the kingdom. So he was a roundabout universalist. Origen had his issues. The guy castrated himself. I mean, he's got problems. So I'm not saying he's a sweetheart, but at the same time, that doesn't give us a reason to throw out Origen's work as unimportant when he was examining evidence. And the difference between Origen and Jerome, in my opinion, is that Jerome had a presupposition. He was not working under his own authority. That's what got Origen in trouble. He didn't give care to what anybody thought. That's why he got kicked out. Jerome was on a leash. It was a long leash, but he had a leash. He was controlled by the church. But in doing so, he came across Didymus the blind. In doing so, Jerome sent teams to the Jewish churches. He investigated the textual variances. He acknowledged variances that we lost track of until manuscripts like this in Codex Washingtonanus, Codex W, in the long ending of Mark. He recognized that there's weird readings that we call the Freer Logion reading. He recognized that. How did he do that? He was investigating manuscripts. So he had good manuscripts. Jerome had good manuscripts. Origen had good manuscripts. Guess what? They have textual variances. So when the Vulgate came together, and Jonathan, I don't think, clarified this, and Dr. Ehrman didn't spend much time on this. I think he avoided Jerome, but you cannot say that the Vulgate is completely Byzantine, no more than Dr. Ehrman could say no second century church father quoted Byzantine readings. As I demonstrated earlier in the show, I showed you the comparisons where the Didache was quoting Byzantine over critical, where you have Polycarp quoting Byzantine over the critical. I could have showed you Clement in places. We could have took a long time to go through a lot of my doctoral work on this, where the Byzantine was quoted early on by the second century patristic writers and fathers. But as a standard, no. So when we're talking about the Vulgate, is it primarily in agreement with an ecclesiastical text like a Byzantine reading? Yes. Is it primarily Byzantine? No. This is my issue with the ecclesiastical text position. the ecclesiastical churches don't agree with each other on all the readings. The ecclesiastical churches would consist of the Syriac, or those in the Coptic churches in Egypt, or those in Rome, like where Jerome was, or the Eastern, the churches of the East, or the Greek churches. What do we have? Textual variances, even amongst the ecclesiastical text. Which ecclesiastical text? Because the different churches that were established by the apostles didn't have the same readings at all times. That's why I reject the ecclesiastical text position ultimately. But it should be noted, Dr. Ehrman avoided Jerome, and he avoided the Vulgate discussion, and I think Jonathan was happy about that. But the question is, do you take Jerome's work to be better than Origen's work at the end of the day? And because Jonathan doesn't like Origen, because he was kicked out by a bishop, he's going to side safer as an ecclesiastical guy that the church was jurisdiction of Jerome was a better one. And it would be noted that Jerome did a better job of investigating when it came to sending out teams to talk to different people and going down to Egypt. It's not like Jerome wasn't familiar with the Egyptian readings. Dr. Ehrman talked about the quotes of Didymus the blind and how he obviously couldn't write. He was blind, but those that scribed for him, their quotes of scripture, guess what? Alexandrian. Well, hello, where were they? In Egypt. Of course, they're going to be more like those readings. Jerome's is more like the Byzantine. Why is that? Because most of his data came from that area. So it makes sense that the textual variances would be different between an Origen and Jerome, because what? The locations had their different readings. The West brought in all these unique readings from the Latin traditions and so forth. And so that needs to be noted, but it should also be noted that Jerome was familiar with the Alexandrian readings. When he went down and had discussions with Didymus the blind, he knew of their existence, but he rejected them. Now, the question of why, and he told us why he rejected them. The question is, do we think he made the right choice when he put the Vulgate together? And was he doing it independently of no presupposition? Again, Jerome was working under the authority of the church. He was on a leash. I don't believe for a minute that Jerome picked everything he believed in. Now, Jonathan would probably sit here and go, whoa, don't say it. Like, that's not true. I don't believe for a minute that Jerome inserted every reading that he was convinced of. I think he had a presupposition to keep. He had a leash to stay on, and I think that navigated some of his choices. But it was a great argument that Dr. Ehrman actually never addressed from Jonathan.
All right. Sam, you got anything to add on to that?
Nope. I think we're out of time as well, from what I understand.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Dr. Boyce, and thanks, Sam, for joining us. Okay, we shall now proceed to the Q&A. Thank you to the chat for your questions. We've got one super chat here directed to Dr. Boyce. It's from Jack Kazanjian. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Kazanjian, J-Y-A-N, I guess. Thanks for your super chat. The question is, even though that Dr. Ehrman used almost the same approach and illustrations, I sense that he is not as hard as he was against Dr. White. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's because Dr. Ehrman and Dr. White didn't get along in their debate. Just go YouTube it. I don't know what kind of pre-conversations they had. I think Dr. Ehrman at one time felt like Dr. White was calling him or comparing him to the Muslims, if I'm not mistaken, that debate. Dr. Ehrman did not like that. So I would say that how the dialogue went before the debate, and Samuel would know more about this than I would because he was he was the middle guy. How you address something up front and how you treat each other up front typically sets the tone for how the rest will go. And the viewpoint is correct. Yes, it was much friendlier. And Dr. White, I consider him a friend. And so I don't know the full story about their pre-discussions and post-discussions or what was written or said. I don't know. I do know this. It didn't go good. So I'm pretty sure Dr. White would say, yep, it didn't go good. And I'm sure Dr. Ehrman would say, yep, it didn't go good. Why all that happened, I don't know, but it was obvious that they got along much better in this debate.
All right. Thanks. Another question for us at Explain Apologetics. Uh, Not sure who wrote it, but the question is, do you know if you can set up any future debates with Bart Ehrman? I'd love to see him debate Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Maybe, possibly. Sam, you want to add
Yeah,
on to it?
yeah, sure. I would love to answer that. I think someone rightly pointed out that sometimes when you get people to debate, you want to arrange debates with people in their field. And I think that was already pointed out earlier, and I thought it was a good response. So, I mean, we're open to that. And yeah, just so you know that some of the things, some of the debates we organize are based on feedback we receive. We take every feedback into consideration. Yeah, it's something that we will consider in the future. But yeah, one of the things we want to do is to get people in the feedback. I mean, sorry, in the same field is my point, and do that. So yeah, if we can find a field where they both touch on the same area, that'll be something worth looking at. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Next question, a last question from Tyler, addressed to both of you. Do Protestants put value in the works of the fathers beyond academic context?
Um, in a sense, let me answer this because I know Stephen has way more to say on this than I do. But I mean, whether you're talking about textual criticism or whether you're talking about theology, uh, Protestants do put value on the church fathers, but we don't do so in the way that the Catholics do, in the sense that we don't consider church fathers the ultimate authority. But I think whenever it's suitable, we certainly like to, lean on the early church fathers as much as possible to make sure that our arguments, as far as historical theology goes, is not just just random, just from nowhere. You're just pulling some new theology down. I think that's what the reformers did. You study the works of Martin Luther, you study the works of John Calvin. They go back to the early church fathers, particularly those in what they consider the classical period, the first 300-400 years, particularly Augustine. All you need
Yep.
to do when you study Calvin's Institutes, look up the bibliography. You will see how many times he references Augustine, how many times he references all the early church fathers. And interestingly, there were other big people he kind of engaged, but you don't see him referencing them that much. You don't see a lot of Aquinas in the work of Calvin. But I'm just saying that it seems that there is a high level of respect for the early church fathers, but do bear in mind, all of us who lean on the early church fathers know that the early church fathers themselves don't get along for most of the time, but when they do, it's very important. So I actually, a few days ago, Stephen and I were talking about the issue of baptism as well. And I know, for example, we have Sam Shamoun in the live chat. I wish Sam Shamoun were on with us right now. On the issues of baptism, for example, when the early church fathers do get united, for example, particularly on the issue of infant baptism versus believers' baptism, credo versus pedo baptism, it becomes important. We do in a sense rely on the early church fathers, not in the sense that they are as authoritative of scripture, no, but we do place value on them, particularly when they're united. It presents a strong case and makes us reconsider our theological positions. And again, I'm not talking about this in the context of the manuscripts, I'm just talking in general. But I think that Dr. Boyce would be the best person to talk about, particularly in the context of the manuscripts.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the fathers are, as Samuel said, they're important to note, but they're not the final authority because they didn't agree with themselves a lot of times. And Samuel's right. Read Calvin. I think he quoted Augustine like 200 or 300 times in the Institutes. These guys weren't unfamiliar with the works of the earlier fathers. The difference is, if you read Augustine, he's not fully on board with Jerome. If you read Jerome, he's not fully on board with Eusebius at times. If you read Eusebius, he's not fully on board with Origen. So, I mean, when you go on and on and on, there are differences, but there are times where they are unified, like what Samuel just said. But here's where they were unified. They were unified on the four Gospels. They were not disunified on which four Gospels were the accurate accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. I found it interesting, and I don't know if anybody else picked up on this. James Snap actually asked Ehrman a question in the question on not on your show, Samuel. It actually came in from the other side. he stumped Ehrman on a question about being a Byzantine reading. I can't remember who he quoted. And he asked, is that not a Byzantine reading? And Dr. Ehrman said, the answer to that is, I don't know. The answer is, Snap's right. It is. And as we've demonstrated earlier in the show, I showed you places where Byzantine readings were early. Snap threw another one in there at Dr. Ehrman. Why? Because the church fathers are important. And so a question like what James Snap threw in, which I showed you in the Didache, Polycarp's epistle, why are these important? Even as I stated earlier, Dr. Ehrman even mentioned the fact that we don't give enough credit to these guys. We don't spend enough time. And I think what I've learned from Dr. Ehrman and his influence on me to study these out, including my dissertation on Codex H, studying the fathers has made me realize that the scripture is that much more reliable. And I think that if we take Dr. Ehrman's advice and we spend more time in the fathers, we're going to find better defenses for the scripture against Dr. Ehrman. And that's exactly what I found in Polycarp's epistle when he says, go read the book of Philippians. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. And you heard Dr. Ehrman. Oh, it's possible. And it's a great question. And that eliminates the copies of copies argument that he has been using over and over and over and over again. If we just studied the fathers, we're finding better defenses. And this is where the strength of the ecclesiastical position is that they want to emphasize the fathers. I think they go too far. I think they'll support a church reading in the early 1900s like Jonathan Sheffield does on the early 1900s text, Greek text. And it's like, yeah, but man, that's years later. You're saying, well, that's because they have the history of the Greek text because they're the church that protected it. Where's the evidence? Where's the trail? Because that's just us taking the church's word for it. The evidence is the manuscripts, and the manuscript evidence doesn't read the way that text does in places. I can't go with the church. That's where the ecclesiastical text position fails. Where it is strong is it forces us to take into consideration the early uses of the text, how they quoted it, when did they quote it, to whom did they quote it to, and looking at the comparison of the manuscripts we have today. That's what I've done my entire dissertation on, is taking all of the quotations of the Old New Testament from First Clement, from Polycarp's epistle, from the Didache, from Ignatius, and comparing them to what we have and seeing what we have. And what do they have? The same New Testament that we have, the same scripture that we have. Yes, there's variants, same ones we have in our manuscript tradition, but they're quoting the same text. In fact, I believe that there's a statement and a question in here. Samuel, and you and I talked about this. I cannot find the question. Somebody asked about the textual variances affecting doctrine.
Oh yeah. Was it the one where Dr. Ehrman responded to the Q&A where it was asked whether if the textual variances affected any essential doctrines, and he sort of mentioned that if you take away the book of Jonah and the book of I think some of the books he mentioned, and then he sort of said that
yes.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing: it most certainly would affect doctrine, and does it affect doctrine? Yes. Does it eliminate doctrine? No. If we lose the book of 2 Peter, I don't think we're losing doctrine. We're losing good stuff. Just chapter 1 alone is significant. His statements about Paul's letters almost becoming that father figure for the church at Rome after Paul was executed, and picking up that apostolic leadership is significant. So do we have the doctrine of the Trinity without 2 Peter? Yes. Do we have the doctrine of God's final judgment and restoration of the universe, the new heavens, new earth, which 2 Peter talks about? Sure. Yeah, we've got it. Of course we do. It's still there. It's in the Old Testament and it's in the New Testament. It's in Isaiah and it's also in Revelation. So yeah, it's in Ezekiel. We still have the doctrine, of course. But that is significant that Dr. Ehrman bit down on that even more, stating that no cardinal doctrine is essentially lost by removing this. Now, Samuel, you can jump in on this because you and I had a discussion about the fact that he stated the documents and the doctrine were almost separate categories. Now, that got me going. And I can't remember exactly how he worded it, because this is important to me because I studied a lot of the Gnostic texts. I've been doing most of my research in my doctoral work classes on the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, all these apocalypses of James and Paul and Peter and 3 Corinthians, all these different extra biblical works. Here's the thing. To say that the doctrine and the documents don't matter together is incorrect. We know very little of the Gnostic doctrines because the documents ceased to exist for almost 1,500 years. Until the discovery in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in the 1940s, we did not have a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas. We did not have a complete gospel copy of the Gospel of Truth. We now do because of Nag Hammadi. And now that we're studying these documents, and if you missed it, Dr. Price and I had a discussion on your show, Samuel, just a few weeks ago or a week or so ago on the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas. Here's what Dr. Price admitted and I had discussed. We don't know what some of these sayings mean. Modern Gnostics don't know what some of these things mean. Why? Gnosticism fell out. The documents were no longer transmitted. They were expelled out of the land of Egypt, like Athanasius expelled those documents and doctrines. And guess what happened when the documents stopped getting transmitted? Guess what else stopped going on with it? The doctrine. So to separate the doctrine from the documents is outrageous. That is why the apostles understood it a necessity to get the oral tradition on documents, because they were going to die. And when they were going to die, they were going to leave without a reliable, transmittable source. Word of mouth changes quicker than written word. Now, again, we have variances. We have problems. Codex W, I've got a facsimile of it right here, has different readings from Vaticanus. We have it, but we don't have a different teaching. We don't have a different doctrine. And if it's left to word of mouth, we're stuck with the ecclesiastical position. Well, for 1900 years, we just got to assume we got it right. A written transmission is important to the written doctrine, because if you don't have the transmitted text, the doctrine will die out with the texts. That's exactly what happened in the Gnostic gospel. Samuel?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. That was my initial thought when I thought about when Ehrman said that, for example, Christians don't base their doctrines from the Bible. You don't believe in the Bible is what he said. He said that Jonathan, my Anglican friend, will agree with me when I say that, you would believe in the resurrection even if you didn't have the Bible. Now, initially, I think that could be misunderstood to mean that. And now when I heard that a few times over and over to make sure I understood him right. To be fair, I think what he's trying to say is that because the context was my question, how should I respond to someone who says that your Bible is corrupted, therefore you can't trust your doctrines, or that your essential doctrines cannot be relied upon? His response is tell them it doesn't matter what the Bible says. What matters is whether it's true or not. It's independent of what the Bible says. Now, I would disagree with that. Because even when you talk about the resurrection, you find that Paul using words like according to the scriptures, to the scriptures. Jesus' ultimate proof of his own resurrection was not his post-mortem appearances to the disciples in Luke 24, 44 to 46. He actually says, this is what I told you, the scriptures foretold these things. So what he's saying, essentially, I would disagree with the theological statement of it, but his response was, how should I respond to someone that tells me that? He's saying, you've got to present an independent defeater to those doctrines. You can't just rely on the fact that just because the textual variances say that, therefore the doctrines go away. The doctrines exist independent of the manuscripts, whatever the variance is. But before he said that, he also mentioned that Christians don't base their doctrine on a single verse or word. Christians believe in a doctrine based on what they understand the whole of the Bible to be saying, not forgetting the traditions. Now, again, we can disagree with, for example, the role of tradition and doctrines and so forth. We can disagree on that. But I guess the point he was trying to say is, if the way you should respond to someone who tells you that just because your Bible is corrupted, don't trust your essential doctrines, is to tell them the doctrines would exist regardless of the variances, because ultimately, for example, Newton's theory is still true. even if the Bible doesn't say it. So you need an independent way to disprove those essential doctrines. That was what I think he was trying to get to. But again, maybe it's my understanding of what he's saying. But yeah, again, I disagree with that. I believe that all our doctrines should come from Scripture and Scripture alone. That's why we believe in sola scriptura. But go ahead, Marcus.
And then and with that, the doctrine and the documents, that they go together. And
Absolutely.
if we don't have the document, we don't have the doctrine. And
Absolutely.
Dr. Ehrman, he took approaches, and I just saw James Snap post on this just a second ago. He was talking about Codex D. I forgot Dr. Ehrman had mentioned about Jesus healing, whether he was angry or not. Codex D is the only manuscript, and not the earliest, by the way. The only manuscript that, depends how you look at this. So D is an interesting manuscript because Dr. Ehrman knows it's not accurate. Codex D is one of the most inaccurate manuscripts we have. It's early, and it seems like the manuscript it was quoting from was accurate, but the scribe was loose in this transmission. But again, we only have one manuscript that really teaches that Jesus was doing that out of anger. And the manuscript that it wasn't Vaticanus, it wasn't Sinaiticus. And obviously those are the two earliest of that text that we have. It's D. We're going to say D's the better one. That's problematic. So when he's talking about earlier being better, he doesn't go with the earliest there. And we need to understand this about the transmission, about the variances as well. How much did it change with the copies of copies of copies? Take P75 and Vaticanus, and all my Byzantine friends are going to shoot me in a minute. But P75 and Vaticanus, on the major portions of differences, are consistent with each other. It appears that P75, which I would date into the late 2nd century, is consistent through some level of transmission in the same family line up to the document like Vaticanus. Why is that important? If P75 is late 2nd century, and I know I have friends that put it in the 3rd, but I think it's about 175, somewhere in the late. If P75, and Dr. Ehrman in the back of, and I don't have misquoting Jesus with me, he mentions in P75 and Vaticanus, he even states are two of the most important manuscripts for the Christians when it comes to textual reliability. Why? Because we're within 100 years or close to 100 and something years, close to 110, 120 years of original autographs in that manuscript. Let's just take John's Gospel. I think John's Gospel was 80 to 90 AD, personally. If P75 is 175 AD, we're talking about within 100 years of John's Gospel. How we read that is important. But if it is transmitted in the major places accurately to the same extent that Vaticanus is, what that shows is that the main message did not change much from early stages, mid stages to a completed manuscript like Vaticanus. The readings, the main readings were made the same. And so that's important when we're understanding transmission. A lot of the Byzantine manuscripts, we can't say that for. Again, most of them are 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th century. That doesn't discredit the Byzantine manuscripts. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. I certainly would not say that. Again, read Origen. He mentioned Origen. A lot of Origen's works had different readings than the Alexandrian. It seems like he went into this more, and again, it's debated whether it's even considered a text type or a reading, but the Caesarean. There's times where Origen makes quotes that are Byzantine. Not major verses like the Pericope Adulterae or something like that, but phrases, comments, like I showed you in the Didache. Mm-hmm. It's not consistent just to label everything generally here. There was, again, Sinaiticus. I'll give you another example. Sinaiticus, Aleph. The first few chapters of John are not Alexandrian in its primary transmission. When you go through the first sections of John, it's Western readings, closer to what you see in Latin. But the rest of it goes right back to Alexandrian. So you can't just categorically throw them all into one place. There's different readings from different manuscripts. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus don't agree with each other in a lot of places. I don't think it makes them not reliable. But again, those kind of things, make me scratch my head a little bit about Dr. Ehrman.
All right, thank you, both of you. We're just gonna go. We are almost close to the 2 hour mark, so we're gonna go with about 2 more questions, and then there's one final, I think, important topic that we do need to touch on, considering the purpose of this debate. But first, to another super chat by Finding Truth. Thank you so much. Erman mentions that the copies of the copies, and that we can't know the text because we don't have the autographs. Doesn't that destroy history as we know it? If we could quickly give a response to that.
I think that's the one I was answering. I knew I saw one pop up there about it. So, I mean, I kind of already answered that.
We kind of answered it already, but
Okay.
yeah, in short, yes. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that Stephen has already expanded on that, but thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Okay, this is, I promise to be the last. I know I said that 2 questions ago, but by Pastor Daniel Isaac, which is the most authoritative book or books on church history, especially from the era when the Bible was being canonized, either online or hard copy.
Bruce Shelley is one of my favorites. I forgot the title of his book. It's been a while. But I know Bruce Shelley did one on church history that was really good. Wait, the question is on church history, right?
Yes. Authoritative book or books on church history.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is if you're going to do church history is wide. So if you want just an overview, go for Bruce Shelley. I'm trying to remember the title of the book. It's just not coming to my head at the moment. Do you remember the title of the book, Stephen, by Bruce Shelley?
No, I know which one. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the title either. I don't have it in front of me either. I have it somewhere in the house.
Yeah. So, so that's one. But the other one that I think that is really important for whether you're talking about early church history, you're talking about the classical period. So, for example, if you want to do apologetics and you want to know the history of the church with regards to apologetics, I have a good book on that one. It's called Christian Apologetics, Past and Present, edited by Scott Oliphant and Edgar something. I have it right here. Yeah. So this book, if you can see it, this is the one it's edited by William Edgar and K. Scott Oliphant, Christian Apologetics, Past and Present. If you want to do church history, but understanding from an apologetics point of view, excellent. But more than that, I just want to stress, if you do want to go church history, you need to go to primary sources. You can read the overviews, that's fantastic, but you need to read primary sources. You need to read Eusebius. Eusebius is very important with regards to church. Is that what you're holding? Oh, yeah, there you go. So I didn't know you were holding that up, but you need to read primary sources. Since he's holding that up, I'll let him quickly answer the rest of this question as well.
Before Dr. Boyce speaks, I think they mentioned the title of the book by Bruce Shelley is Church History in Plain Language.
That's the one. That's the one. Thank you.
Thanks, Chad.
I have had this question asked to me numerous times. I can't tell you how many text messages and Facebook messages I have received in the last 24 hours on that question. And I'm going to give them all the same answer. You got to start with Eusebius. He was the first compiling together of fathers and quotes. He has preserved so much that we do not have anymore. History about bishops, history about church fathers. Most of what we have of transmission of leaders and the stories of the apostles and even Peter's wife and all kinds of stuff like that right here, Eusebius. He's the one that is, I think you got to start there. He's the earliest one that brings it out. That to me is important. What did the earliest fathers and patristic writers say about their own history? Eusebius is early 4th century. So he's writing from studying from the early 4th century back all the way to the late 1st century with the apostles and their followers. He's collecting all of the work and he's putting together a compiled historical account of the Gospels. He talks about Gnostic Gospels in here. He talks about the heresies that came into the church. He talks about how the churches dealt with those heresies. So if you're going to start in church history, I mean, look, I bought this. I can't remember. I think I bought this for like $12 on Amazon. I mean, there is absolutely no reason in this world I'm trying to find the price tag. I think I paid $12. But yeah, I mean, he's giving us inside information about fathers, patristic writers, and issues, the Arian heresy that came in, all of it, that most of which we don't have documentation of anymore. He's preserved it in his writings. You need to have Eusebius.
All right, excellent. Thank you both to everyone who asked a question, and also thank you to our speakers. Now to the final concluding, I guess, question, and I think it's the most crucial question, I believe, with regards to the debate, is especially when you hear Dr. Ehrman speak, and we've mentioned that he's really a popular figure on textual criticism. How does this sort of affect our understanding of inerrancy and inspiration? You know, when we talk about all these variances and stuff like that, it's always a question that always comes up. You know, how are we supposed to understand the doctrine of inerrancy?
Well, I'll let Samuel answer.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I'll let you answer it quick, but I was going to answer in the post. He was asking for the name. It's Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. For the one that asked what was the name of Eusebius, it's Ecclesiastical History. It's his most famous work. Sorry, you go ahead and answer first. Just wanted to make sure somebody had asked the name of the book. So.
Sure. Yeah, just in short, how it affects biblical inerrancy. Now, biblical inerrancy is an important one. For the person who asked on biblical inerrancy, I would recommend you to an interview I did few months ago with Wayne Grudem, who really is someone who has written extensively on this area. We have that interview on Explain Apologetics. Go look up our videos. It's not too long ago, just about a few months ago, we did this interview with Wayne Grudem on biblical inerrancy, and we touch on how textual variances do affect that, or rather how we understand biblical inerrancy in light of the textual variances we have. Now, according to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, the statement that came out in the 1970s, biblical inerrancy pertains to the autographs, that which the apostles wrote. We kind of spoke about that just now. And we realized that anyone who copies the scriptures, there's going to be differences. No one copy would agree with the other, if I understand correctly. And so in light of that, what we believe today, now it doesn't matter whether you hold to the Textus Receptus only, or you hold to Byzantine priority, or you hold to the ecclesiastical text, or you hold to the critical text theory. If you do hold to biblical inerrancy, you believe that we can know today, we can know what the apostles wrote. We have, for example, God has blessed us with a rich manuscript tradition. No matter what you believe in, really, if you do hold to biblical inerrancy, you believe that we can go back to the originals based on the rich manuscript tradition we have. Even Dan Wallace would say that we have an embarrassing riches of manuscript tradition that enables us to go back and know what the apostles wrote. So again, I'm not, if you notice, I'm not actually saying where I stand on this issue, but regardless of that, I think that understanding is important, that when we talk about biblical inerrancy, we are speaking primarily of the autographs. But I'll let Stephen take that as well.
No, I agree with Samuel. I think what's inerrant is what represents the original text of what was on the original autographs. If those words represent and reflect what was on the original autograph, they are in its essence inerrant. Infallible is more on the message side of it. The teaching. Is it capable of misguiding us and leading us into error? I certainly, and again, Samuel's right about whether TR or critical. I believe we have the inerrant word of God. I just don't think it's constructed the way we want. I think we want the inerrant word of God to just be plastered in order with no problems. Scroll floats down from heaven on cloud 9. I mean, that's how we want it. I think within the body of manuscripts, we have everything that was on the original documents. I don't think it's on a single manuscript. I don't believe one manuscript contains it, because no two Greek manuscripts read identically. John Beasley and I co-wrote an article about this almost a year ago, and it blew up all over the internet because we affirm the fact that we believe that the Bible is inerrant, but we don't believe you can go to one single manuscript or text and say, there it is. For the most part, you can. But we still believe it's infallible. Now, when it comes to this area, the critical text will do a better job of giving you the inerrant than a TR. And I'll tell you why, or a Byzantine. In the critical text, you have an apparatus. You have a list of different readings. You have a reading in the main text with notes of different readings from other manuscript traditions like we're talking about. For example, if you're going through the story of Mark, like we talked about, that Dr. Ehrman would say, probably from a Latin tradition mixed in with Codex D, because Codex D is Western, and Western readings come from Latin traditions a lot of times. You have Jesus healing out of anger. Now, the critical text, or a Nestle Holland, or United Society Bible Society's text, will give you a reading that's not that. But they will note the fact that that reading exists. You have an apparatus you can go to. If you have Logos, if you use Still Bible Works or something like that, or the Accordance or something like that, you can go to an apparatus and see the different readings. So when you're looking at that passage in Mark chapter 1, it's not a question of do we have the original word, it's which one is it? So we have the inerrant word. The question is it D, which it stands by itself, and I would say no, or is it the other? It's kind of like the illustration. I've heard Dr. White use this, and he borrowed it from somebody else. The New Testament's like a 10,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. The problem is we have 10,100 pieces. That's a better problem than having 9,900 pieces. The question isn't, do we have the inerrant word? It's which ones are they? Because we, over history, have accumulated traditions, Latin traditions, textual variances that came in from scribal insertions, etc. Now we have extra. And textual criticism is figuring out which one of the 100 extra pieces actually belongs in the puzzle. That's what textual criticism is. So I believe we have the inerrant words. It's just that textual criticism has to work through what would have been the original one. You don't have that in some of these other textual compilations. So inerrancy, do I believe in it? Yes. Do I believe it's simple? No. Infallibility, I do believe the scripture will lead us in truth. I don't think we're going to run into error by following scripture.
One final word I would say before we close, and before I pass, I need to realize that I'm not the moderator of today, but I want to say I did see a message on the live chat saying that James White seems to be walking away from against biblical inerrancy, and I can tell you that I'm having exchanged close to 100 emails with the man, and having him on the channel for close to 10 hours, maybe, I don't know, if you combine all the hours that he spent on this channel, I can tell you that James White will fight tooth and nail for biblical inerrancy. He is a champion of biblical inerrancy, and that is one thing he would fight for. So, and I could say that could not be further from the truth. Just because you hold to a different theory of the text, well, a theory of the text, for example, critical theory or Textus Receptus, you cannot say that people disagree, because the very guys that came up with the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, I believe many of them, if not most of them, were actually holding to the critical text theory. So now, that's it. I just want to add that point because that's very important. We should not slander a brother in Christ, especially a brother who has defended biblical inerrancy time and time again. So with that, I pass the time to you, Marcus.
All right. That comes to the end of our live stream for today. We want to thank every one of you for participating in the live chat, for your questions, and of course we definitely want to thank both our speakers today, Pastor Samuel Nason and also Dr. Stephen Boyce, for the wonderful discussion and the wonderful review of the debate. If you have not liked and subscribed to our channel, please do so. You can click the button below, press the notification bell so that you receive every single thing that we are posting up on our YouTube. And we thank you very much for your support. Also want to say that we have our new Patreon account. It's in the link in the description box below. So if you If you are feeling generous and you would like to support us in any way, we greatly appreciate every single help that you can give to us. And we thank you very much for your support. With that, on behalf of both our speakers, we say thank you. And till next time, we'll see you again. Goodbye.